It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you to kind of try and help us to think through some aspects of culture and aging with a specific focus on dementia. I think my job is to set the context for the conference and to help us to think through the significance of culture, what culture is, and how it might be particularly significant in relation to dementia. And also to give you some reflections, some theological reflections, some ways of thinking about things that explore the issue of community and citizenship. So if I can do that, then it's worth the trip from Sydney. I've been living in Sydney since August. Do I have a kind of Sydney accent, do you think? What do you think, Bruce? Anyway, I hope I don't. So let me begin by just thinking through one or two things. Having dementia is a risky business. Now, what I mean by that is the place that you experience dementia, the culture within which you experience dementia is profoundly important. Some people will want to hurt you. Some people will forget about you. You may lose your story in some people's eyes, and people may become inhospitable towards you. You know, Scotland is at the moment part of Europe, but not a few hundred miles away from where I live, people are able to take the lives of people with dementia simply because they have a diagnosis of dementia. And so as soon as you have a diagnosis of dementia, you can go to your family doctor and ask to be euthanized. Not because of the way that you are at that moment in time, but because of the fear of the future, the fear of what you become. And so the state seems very happy with that. But families are less happy with that in the sense that what happens is that, Uncle Fred or Auntie Betty just disappears. And they have to work through grief in a very different way. But also, interestingly, there's some research come out that suggests that doctors are suffering from PTSD because you're trained to be a doctor to do one thing and something else is the reality. So there's something strange about a culture that says if you have this degree of brain damage, then your life is meaningless. And I want us to think about why it is that some of the ways of thinking are just written into our culture in ways that we don't really notice. This is Baroness Mary Warnock, a very important British ethicist who's done some very interesting work on personhood and end-of-life issues. In an interview with the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, I'm a Presbyterian, which is the one true church, some would say, but I wouldn't say that. In their magazine, The Life and Work, she was being interviewed about a variety of things around ethics and her life. And for no obvious reason, she began to talk about dementia. And she began to say that, actually, if I ever get dementia, I want you to take my life. She said it's basically not worth living. This is what she said. She said, if you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, and you're wasting the resources of the National Health Service. The dynamic there being, if you can't contribute, if you can only take from the state, then you have to take action there. Actually, it says people with dementia have a duty to die. Putting it rather brutally, you'd be licensing people to put others down. And she suggests that there should be groups of people within the healthcare system who make an assessment, and then it's the responsibility of the person with dementia, or perhaps their family, to make a decision. Actually, I think, why not? Because the real person is gone already, and all that's left is just the body of a person, and nobody wants to be remembered in that condition. So that struck me as quite startling, quite stark, but not particularly unusual in the way that we oftentimes think about dementia, subconsciously at least. And so I want to tease out why it is that someone from a culture like our own can look at another human being and see them quite differently from the way that perhaps most of us in this room see that individual. So the problem that we have with Mary Warnock in that context, and for many of us, is the problem of personhood. So as you'll probably know, within kind of ethical conversations, people separate humanness from personhood, and then make ethical decisions on the basis of personhood. And so personhood is usually defined by certain capacities that you have, your ability to think, your ability to remember, your ability to do a variety of things, one of which in a capitalist economy is to contribute. You remain human, but you lose your personhood. If you lose your personhood, you fall out with the moral protection of the state, or a moral protection of whatever context that you're in. So what you see with Mary Warnock is a very sharp example of the problem of personhood in relation to people with dementia. When personhood is defined by certain capacities that are prized by society, then people with dementia find themselves in difficulties as they move along the dementia journey, because the things that society tends to prioritize are the very things that people are moving away from. So Jean Vanier, who some of you will be familiar with, we had a day's seminar yesterday, so we spent some time with Jean Vanier, which is always a wonderful thing. We'll come back to Jean later on. But he says, tears and violence can be ways of protecting ourselves from what is unbearable, from our own vulnerability, from our own pain. So why is it then that the experience of dementia draws out that kind of violence, that kind of negative, deeply negative response that ends up with suggesting that you should not be here, you don't have the right to live? So we want to tease that out. And we want to tease that out by looking at the type of culture that we live within. You know, I did 2 trainings as a nurse, and I trained as a hospital chaplain over the years. And in each of these contexts, I had several courses on intercultural conversations and intercultural dialogues, explaining how I should be understanding other cultures and how other cultures should impact upon my practice as a nurse or as a chaplain or whatever. I never had one class on my own culture, how European culture impacts upon the way in which I look at people, see people, and respond to people. And I think there's a deep flaw. The assumption was always, well, our way is the right way. You have to learn other people's ways. So let's think about what culture is. Culture is an important aspect for the experience of dementia, because the place that we experience dementia makes a huge difference. So what's culture? At a visible level, it's your environment and your behavior. The missiologist Leslie Newbegin describes culture as what we do around here. And that's probably the simplest way to think about culture. But there's invisible dimensions to culture that are really, really important. Values and attitudes, things that are bred into us that we never think about unless somebody raises our consciousness to things. And so we're full of values, full of attitudes, full of assumptions that we never challenge, even though when sometimes you raise them, they're problematic. And fundamental assumptions and beliefs about the world. So culture shapes our perception, the things we perceive, we think that we see. It shapes our behavior. It shapes our personalities, because you learn your personality. You learn how to be who you are in the world through your interaction with other people. But it also, and importantly, shapes our descriptions. Now, the way in which you describe something determines what you think you see. And what you think you see determines how you will respond to what you think you see. So actually the way that you describe the word, the language that you use around anything, and in particular dementia, it really is profoundly practically significant, because what you think you see is how your response is shaped. So culture is really important. But the thing about culture is that you don't notice it. So everybody in this room has a worldview. We've all been shaped primarily by European culture. But you don't see your worldview. So worldview is something that you look through, but you don't see it, unless you stand back and somebody points something out. So this morning I want us to stand back a little bit and not simply look through our worldview, but actually look at our worldview. So the language that we use creates the world that we see. So it's not by the way that people are always talking about we should use the right language in terms of aging and the right language in terms of people with dementia, because actually the language that you speak about people determines what you think you say. And that becomes particularly sharp with people with advanced dementia, for example, when people start to use language like he or she is not the person they used to be. Because if he or she is not the person they used to be, then who is this person before you? And why would you love them? Why would you care for them? So that kind of language, which is actually deeply embedded in the kind of ideas of personhood that we have, is very important. So what kind of worlds did you create today in your conversations, in your thought life? So culture shapes our description of humanness and also shapes our description of personhood. As you read through the literature on personhood, you can see very clearly that the priorities that ethicists in particular give to particular models of personhood mirror the priorities that we have as a culture. So within Western culture, our own culture, European culture, whatever that looks like, we prioritize intellect, reason, individualism, autonomy, freedom, choice, and self-direction. And even in something as profoundly important as the disability rights movement or dementia activist movement, these priorities, modern priorities, tend to be pushed towards the front. You know, you've got to stand up for yourself, you've got to advocate for yourself, you've got to have self-direction, all of which is good. The problem comes when later on in your dementia journey, these are the very things that you begin to lose. And so if you create a model of personhood, and almost by definition a model of humanness that sees these things as the priority, then you have precisely the kind of conversation that Mary Warnock had with the Presbyterian Church magazine. It just feels normal. It makes perfect sense. If you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, and you're wasting the resources of the National Health Service. Of course you are. In a capitalist economy, your value is gauged by your job, your employment, your ability to contribute. It makes perfect sense that when you can no longer do these things, your life is meaningless. You don't have any possibility of anything important. If you're not intellectual, if you can't use your reason, if you can't remember things, if you can't think quickly, of course your life is meaningless. Or so we would think, the way that we've been shaped and formed. And you'll hear people talking like that all the time. People with dementia are a waste of time and resources. And within that context, of course, people with dementia have a duty to die. Now, I want to tease that out a little bit. One of the really interesting conversations around dementia and personhood just now revolves around the issue of citizenship. And so there's a kind of ongoing conversation where some people think that the models of personhood, which have to do with relationality and community and love and connectedness, are not political enough to do the job that's necessary to protect people with dementia. So people are suggesting that we need to think more carefully about citizenship, that political activism is actually a better way of ensuring a person's personhood in that sense, a political personhood, than standard models of personhood. And it's a really interesting conversation, and it's a really important conversation, because in order for us to be able to live in love and community, we do need to have a political system that enables us to do that. So the conversation is important. But it's also problematic. So think about keeping in mind that idea that people with dementia have a duty to die. So if we take the model of citizenship, so that suggestion we should maybe move from personhood to citizenship. Good conversation, valid, and very, very important, but problematic. So underlying that is the idea of human rights, very important also. So human rights relate to justice, equality, inclusion, and access. And these things are fundamentally important because I think if we have legislation that ensures that we don't discriminate against people with disabilities, then we have the possibility of a more inclusive, more equal community. So that's all good thus far. So sitting at the center of human rights is the idea of freedom, rights, and duties. So citizens are free to make their own decisions. Citizens are free to live the way that they want within the boundaries of the law. And citizens are free to create their own narratives and create their own ways of being in the world. Citizens have the rights protected by the state to ensure that that's the case. Right? And they have a duty to ensure, the state has a duty to ensure that that's the case. And also human beings have both rights and duties towards themselves and towards one another. And that's when it becomes problematic. Because if you have a right to live, you also may by that same structure, have a duty to die. So rights and duties without some kind of intermediary way of emphasizing a certain form of responsibility can become highly problematic for people with advanced dementia. Now, people who are in the earlier stages of their journey, citizenship in this political form is probably really, really important. To be able to advocate for yourself, to be able to engage with the political process, to be able to do the things that every other citizen does is clearly something that we want to encourage. But if we shift completely to that model, then the further on your dementia journey, the more problematic that becomes. So it's limited, but helpful, but also limited. So personal rights, autonomy, dignity, freedom, agency, and self-representation, central to that kind of political citizenship. But at the same time, these are the very things that people are losing. So there's a very difficult tension between encouraging and recognizing the significance of the citizenship, but also recognizing that it doesn't necessarily function well throughout a person's dementia experience. So what we need is a middle point. We need a way of thinking about the significance of politics, but also the significance of personhood, and perhaps the significance of theology as we move along. So social citizenship, love, and the possibility of belonging. The first thing I would say is that social citizenship might be a better way for us to think about participation this way. Social citizenship is a relationship, practice, or status in which a person with dementia is entitled to experience freedom from discrimination and have the opportunity to grow and participate in life to the fullest extent possible. It involves justice, recognition of social position, and the upholding of personhood, rights, and a fluid degree of responsibility for shaping events at a personal and social level. So within the idea of social citizenship, what we have is an amalgamation that recognizes the importance of personhood, of community and love and friendship and family, but at the same time recognizes that in order for these things to be ensured, we need to have appropriate political structures. So political citizenships, you focus on voting, rights and duties. Social citizenship, rights, personhood, and relationships. But just to flag up that even within a more social view of citizenship, there is an inherent problem with the way that we think about things sometimes. So if you take the issue, for example, of inclusion. So disability rights activists, dementia advocates are very keen, quite rightly, that people with disabilities or people with dementia are included within our communities.
Your mobile data is turned off, but I can't help you.
So you didn't know I was a ventriloquist, did you? That's right. It's a Gotleg ear. I've forgotten what I'm saying. Oh, yes, now I remember what I'm saying now. So inclusion is the kind of political thrust, and that's a good thing. But the problem with inclusion is that it can create spaces where people with dementia or people with disabilities or people with mental health challenges can come into a building, but it doesn't mean that you have to like them or try to love them. So all rights and inclusion does is creates a space. What I want us to think about is that we need something different. We need to think about rights as a way of creating a basic space, but we also need to think about how we make that space a place of belonging. So let me give you an example of that, what that tension looks like. So I spent a little bit of time a while ago looking at the spiritual needs of people with profound intellectual disabilities. And one of the young men that I worked alongside, he was probably in his mid-20s. And when he was younger, he had always gone to church. But he hadn't been to church for about 5 or 6 years. And the reason he hadn't been going to church is because he lived in a care home, and the people that he were looking after him weren't religious and didn't feel that they were able to take him along because they weren't religious, which is a little bit odd. Anyway, so they took him along to this church, and they took him along for 3 months. And 3 months he went along, and in that 3-month time, in these 3 months, nobody spoke to him. One person patted him on the head as they walked by on one day, and that was it. And so they didn't go back after that. But that's an illustration of the difference between inclusion and belonging. So to be included, you just have to be there. And he was there. Legally, absolutely fine. But in order to belong, there's something different. People had to engage with him, had to miss him, had to love him, had to care for him, had to make a bit of an effort to include him in a way that is meaningful and relational. So I want us to be thinking about the significance of the political system, but at the same time, the significance that it's inadequate. And we need that dimension of belonging. And so I want us then now to think a little bit about how theology can help us to understand that. And the theological images I want to give to you, and I recognize that not everybody in this room would be interested in theology, but let me just bear with me. If you're inviting a theologian to speak at a conference, you'll get theology out. But I want to present them in ways that are open enough for those of us who for whom that way of thinking is central, can include all of us in different ways. So, first thing to think about is the issue of citizenship. One of the fascinating things that you find in Christian theology is that idea of your citizenship being in 2 places. So your citizenship is in heaven, so that gives you something to look forward to. But your citizenship is also embodied in the polis. It's embodied in the world as you know it. So Christians are called to engage with the world as it is. So Christians are called to engage with politics, to social justice, engage with the world the way things are. Likewise, spiritual carers are called to engage with the politics of the world. Because sometimes when we think about spirituality, we think about, loving relationships, you and me together to do lovely things, which is great. But if your system doesn't allow you to do that, if you haven't got the time to do that, if you haven't got the inclination from your management to do that, then you're never going to be able to do good spiritual care. So in that sense, even though if you're not taking it from a theological perspective, your spiritual life is deeply embedded in your political life in that sense. So 4 things to think about. I want us to think about this idea of radical political hospitality. Now, by radical, I mean going to the roots of the way that hospitality has been understood. And by political, I mean deeply embodied in the world and engaged with the politics of the world, but not defined by the politics of the world. Because politics, in all of the different forms, can be helpful. So the first thing to notice is, in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus says, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Isn't that an interesting thing? Because sometimes you think that heaven is somewhere else. But actually, if you read that prayer, if you worked it properly, heaven is here in this moment. So heaven is not somewhere you go to escape from the world. It's somewhere you go to encounter the world in a different way, in a radically different way. And the question is, what does that look like? Well, the first thing to notice in relation to heaven being on earth is that within the hospitality that you see in the life of Jesus, everybody is welcome. So Jesus sits with tax collectors, sinners, and prostitutes. Not reformed tax collectors, sinners, and prostitutes, but people who are just doing their thing. And he engages with them, and some people are changed, some people are not changed. But the essence of the relationship is hospitality. And the interesting thing about that type of hospitality is it runs like this. Sometimes Jesus is a guest, sometimes Jesus is a host. Sometimes he's a guest, host. So you get that dynamic from guesting to hosting, from guesting to hosting. And when he's a host, he opens himself up to the other person. He doesn't try to transform the other person into his own image in that sense. He listens, he thinks, he opens, and offers that kind of radical hospitality. So I think that the first place for us to begin in relation to developing a counter politics is to think about radical hospitality. Radical hospitality towards people with dementia, but radical hospitality towards everyone. You know, if you think about something like interreligious dialogue, so the way that it oftentimes runs is like this. Everybody gathers around a table, and everybody hones off the sharp edges of their own particular belief structure. And so eventually the hope is that we'll find a place of neutrality where everything will be just fine. And of course, that means that everybody's frustrated. True hospitality is when I can be me and you can be you. So when I can be a Christian, you can be a Jew, you can be a Muslim, and we can have a conversation. And maybe through that conversation we'll become friends. And maybe maybe over time we'll learn from one another. And maybe over time we'll make the world a slightly better place. That kind of radical hospitality that you see in Jesus is actually a very practical principle for the way that we can engage with one another. And so when we're thinking about the politics of inclusion and belonging, radical hospitality sits right at the heart of that. But also, that radical hospitality includes justice. So Amos talks about, he says, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. There's something very profound about looking after people whom society victimizes and bullies. Justice rolled down like a river sits in tension with belonging. So the politics that we engage in, the way that we structure our society is profoundly important for our ability to develop radical hospitality. So justice is a fundamentally important aspect of citizenship, whether you look at that theologically or whether you look at that in a secular context. And finally, God is love. Love is the principle that drives where we're going. We'll come back to that in a second. So I'm suggesting to you that we need to move from a politics of inclusion to a theology of belonging, to a movement, to a modification of political citizenship, which actually puts people with advanced dementia at risk, to a different kind of social citizenship, within which the theology of belonging opens up fresh space for true justice. And true justice demands that we look at people and see them properly, not that we look at people through our cultural lenses and judge them according to what the majority may assume to be a good thing. So, central to a theology of belonging and the politics of social politics of citizenship is gentleness. It's interesting in Matthew 12:29, Jesus says, I am gentle. So the God who creates the world and flings the stars into space says that a fundamental aspect of who he is gentle. Not that I practice gently, that I am gentle. Now, when you think about the kind of statement that Mary Warnock makes in relation to dementia, there's no gentleness in that. When you think of the structures that say that, well, I'm afraid of having dementia, so therefore please take my life, and someone has to do that, there is no gentleness in that. If we begin to think gently, then we begin to recognize that perhaps the key issue in relation to those of us who have a diagnosis of dementia is fear. It's fear of the future. Or maybe it's fear of you and me. Fear of the way in which you and I look at us. Fear of the way in which you and I treat us. Fear of the way in which services deal with us. Gentleness, like love, helps us to overcome our fear. So if we begin to think gently, begin to take that idea, which of course is a ridiculous idea. How could you do your politics gently? But then if you look at the life of Jesus, that's kind of the way that it ran. Ridiculous is always the norm. But if you begin, even in your own practice, begin to think gently, then many, many things will shift and change. So it may be that you don't change the wider political system, but you can change yourself in that sense. As Michael Jackson once said, if you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make that change. Ooh! So, you thought he was dead, right? But it's true. Because once you break through that cultural wall, once you begin to see things differently, once you view your politics, your community, your relationships differently, then you can't help but change. We live in a hyper-cognitive society where people love intellect and reason. We need to drop our thinking down into our hearts. Now, Jean Vanier talks about the way of the heart. He says the heart is the deepest, most fundamental aspect of the human being that's touched and transformed by the Spirit. And that's the essence of Vanier. Vanier spent his life living with people with profound intellectual disabilities, people who can't symbolize, people who standard religious structures say, well, they can't possibly be a part of us because they can't think the way that we do. And the thing that he realized very early on was that your intellect's got nothing to do with it. It's your heart that matters. And when you're with people who are non-cognitive, you know what that feels like because it's your body that matters. It's your position. It's the way that you look at one another. It's the way that you engage heart to heart with people that brings about the possibility of seeing things differently. And those of you who work alongside people with dementia know exactly what that means. That if you can have that heartfelt connection with people, you see all sorts of stuff that you wouldn't see if you were constantly focusing on either tasks or the topic, or your intellect. So if we let our thinking drop down into our hearts, then we have a different politics. A politics of gentleness, a theology of belonging, a way of being that is completely countercultural. But the key thing that I want you to take away is when you begin to think in these ways, you can see through the cultural veneer. You can see that the way in which we think, the way in which we look at people, the way in which we deal with people, the things that we prioritize are simply wrong-headed very often. When we begin to drop our thinking down into our hearts, we can also able to have our minds transformed and we can see things differently. And I think maybe in terms of this conference, that's what you guys are called to do. To allow each of the speakers that speaks today, to all the different groups, your conversations, look upon them as ways of raising your consciousness to things that you hadn't considered before. Be hospitable to views that you really don't agree with, because if you're hospitable to them, you may actually learn something. You may actually end up seeing the world differently. So rights are important, advocacy important. People need people to stand up for them. People with advanced dementia in particular need people to stand up for them. People earlier on in their journey can stand up for themselves. But there comes a time when people need you, need me to be hospitable advocates in a system that actually militates against love. Gentleness and friendship. So kindness is love made visible. And that's your task in life, but maybe it's a task for the conference to help you to think about what that looks like. So, that's your homework. Thanks for listening.